In the late spring of 2007, in a quiet Midwestern town where routines rarely broke and familiarity gave residents a sense of safety, a 17-year-old girl walked out of her high school during a free period, unaware that this simple, almost forgettable decision would mark the final confirmed moment of her life. Her name was Kara, a teenager known among her friends for her bold honesty, restless energy, and a personality that seemed to fill any room she entered. She lived with her mother and stepfather and shared her home with a younger brother who looked up to her, even when she was going through the typical turbulence of adolescence. Like many teenagers, Kara was navigating identity, independence, and relationships, sometimes making choices that reflected both curiosity and insecurity, such as experimenting with her appearance or adopting habits she would later regret. Still, she was responsible enough to hold a steady job at a local restaurant, showing up for shifts, earning her own money, and slowly building a sense of independence that made her proud. To those who knew her best, she was not someone who would simply vanish without explanation. That was what made the events of May 4th so unsettling from the very beginning. That morning started like any other school day, with classes, hallway chatter, and the quiet rhythm of routine. At some point after 9 a.m., Kara found herself with a free period and made the decision to leave campus. It wasn't entirely out of character she had skipped before, and no immediate alarm was raised when she didn't return. But as the hours passed, small concerns began to grow into something heavier. By the end of the school day, when she failed to show up for her shift at work, concern turned into worry, and worry quickly sharpened into fear. Calls to her phone went unanswered, and when her mother learned that Kara had not appeared where she was expected, she acted quickly, reporting her missing that very day. What authorities discovered early on only deepened the sense that something was wrong. Kara's belongings were still at home, her clothes, her savings, her personal items, and there were no signs that she had planned to leave voluntarily. Her phone activity had ceased entirely, and her debit card showed no usage. Everything pointed toward an abrupt and unplanned disappearance. Almost immediately, attention turned toward someone who had already been a troubling presence in Kara's life, her ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had lasted several months and had been marked by intensity that gradually shifted into something darker. What began as attraction had turned into control, and people close to Kara had noticed changes in her behavior over time. She became less vibrant, more withdrawn, as if weighed down by something she could not easily escape. Eventually, she ended the relationship, but her former boyfriend did not accept the breakup. In fact, just days before she vanished, Kara had reported a deeply alarming incident to the police, claiming that he had forced her into his car and taken her against her will before releasing her miles away. She described a pattern of escalating behavior, including physical violence and threats, and she sought legal protection out of fear for her safety. That protection order was officially served only a few days before she disappeared. When investigators questioned him after Kara went missing, he denied any involvement and claimed he had not seen her that day. At first glance, he appeared cooperative, answering questions and maintaining that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. However, phone records told a more troubling story. Kara had contacted him shortly after leaving school, and he had returned her call minutes later, placing him in direct contact with her at the exact window of time when she was last seen alive. This contradiction immediately raised suspicion, yet suspicion alone was not enough to build a case. In the weeks that followed, search efforts were organized. Volunteers combed through areas surrounding the town, and the community rallied around Kara's family, hoping for answers. But no trace of her was found. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and gradually the intensity of the search began to fade, leaving behind a lingering question that refused to be answered. What had happened to Kara? Over the years, the investigation remained open, but struggled to gain momentum. The same name continued to surface again and again, not only because of his connection to Kara, but also because of his increasingly erratic and troubling behavior. He accumulated legal troubles, ranging from minor offenses to more serious allegations involving violence and substance abuse. People who had once been close to him began to come forward with disturbing claims, describing patterns of jealousy, aggression, and control that mirrored what Kara had experienced. Some even claimed that he had confessed to killing her, though these statements were often dismissed as unreliable or lacking sufficient evidence to move forward. At one point, investigators attempted to gather stronger proof by asking a former partner of his to engage him in conversation while authorities listened, hoping he might repeat his confession. During that exchange, he made chilling remarks that seemed to imply responsibility, speaking in a detached and unsettling manner about taking a life and leaving a body in the wilderness. Yet even then, the evidence was not enough to secure charges. It was as though the truth lingered just beyond reach, visible but untouchable. Meanwhile, Kara's family endured years of uncertainty, caught in a painful limbo between hope and grief. Her mother remained steadfast in her belief that the person responsible was the same one who had caused her daughter so much fear before she disappeared. She continued to push for answers, refusing to let the case be forgotten, even as time passed and public attention waned. Nearly a decade went by with no resolution, and for many it seemed as though the case might never be solved. But in 2016, events took a tragic turn that would ultimately bring everything back into focus. Another young woman disappeared under circumstances that bore unsettling similarities. She had last been seen leaving a gathering with the same man who had long been associated with Kara's case. Within hours, her vehicle was discovered burned, and witnesses came forward with alarming accounts of his behavior that night. He had been drinking heavily, acting aggressively, and displaying possessive tendencies toward her. Soon after, a family member reported that he had confessed to harming her and disposing of her body. This time, the evidence was more immediate, more tangible, and authorities moved quickly to arrest him. As investigators worked to uncover the truth about this new disappearance, they began to uncover connections that reached back nearly 10 years. The same patterns, the same behaviors, the same shadow of suspicion that had followed him for so long now took on new weight. The past and present collided, and the possibility that he had been responsible for more than one crime became impossible to ignore. Still, there were challenges. Key witnesses were unreliable or unavailable, and the passage of time had eroded much of the physical evidence that might have once existed. Yet despite these obstacles, the case continued to build, piece by piece, as investigators revisited old leads and re-examined everything they thought they knew. Then, in the spring of 2017, a discovery was made that would finally bring a measure of closure, though not without deep sorrow. In a rural area, not far from where both women had last been seen, human remains were found. Soon after, a second set was located nearby. Forensic analysis confirmed what many had feared. The remains belonged to the two missing women, linking their fates in a way that was both tragic and undeniable. After years of uncertainty, Kara had been found, but the answer came with the devastating confirmation that she had not survived. The investigation, which had once seemed stalled and uncertain, now moved toward a long-awaited confrontation with the truth. Prosecutors began preparing a case that would bring together years of evidence, testimonies, and confessions, aiming to finally hold someone accountable for what had happened. For Kara's family, the discovery marked the end of one painful chapter and the beginning of another, the pursuit of justice for a life taken too soon. And while the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, delays, and emotional trials, one thing was now certain. The mystery that began on that quiet morning in 2007 had not been forgotten, and the story was far from over. The discovery of the remains in that quiet, rural stretch of land transformed what had once been a cold and uncertain investigation into a case that could finally be brought before a court of law, though the path to justice would prove just as complex and emotionally charged as the years that preceded it. For nearly a decade, the unanswered questions surrounding Kara's disappearance had lingered like a shadow over her family and community, but now, with physical evidence connecting two victims to the same location, investigators were able to construct a clearer narrative, one that pointed directly toward a man who had long existed on the edges of suspicion. By the time of this discovery, he was already in custody for crimes related to the second victim, whose disappearance in 2016 had unfolded with alarming speed and left behind a trail of evidence that was far more immediate than anything available in the earlier case. Witness statements, the burned vehicle, and the testimony of someone close to him who claimed he had admitted to the crime all combined to create a far stronger foundation for prosecution. Yet even with this momentum, building a case that stretched across nearly 10 years required careful coordination as prosecutors sought to weave together past and present without allowing the weaknesses of one case to undermine the strength of the other. Ultimately, they made the strategic decision to try both cases together, believing that the similarities between them would help demonstrate a consistent pattern of behavior and intent. This approach was not without controversy, as the defense argued that combining the cases could unfairly prejudice the jury, but the court allowed it, setting the stage for a trial that would revisit years of pain, missed opportunities, and lingering doubt. As preparations began, the prosecution assembled a wide array of witnesses, including individuals who claimed the accused had confessed to them at various points over the years. These alleged confessions, though troubling, presented their own challenges, as defense attorneys questioned their reliability, suggesting that they were exaggerated, misinterpreted, or motivated by personal grievances. Still, the sheer number of such accounts created a narrative that was difficult to ignore, especially when considered alongside the pattern of controlling and violent behavior described by multiple former partners. Among the most critical witnesses had been a close relative who had initially come forward with detailed information about the events surrounding the second victim's disappearance, including claims that the accused had admitted to both the killing and the attempt to destroy evidence by burning the vehicle. However, in a tragic and unexpected development, this key witness died before the trial could take place, removing a central piece of testimony and complicating the prosecution's efforts. The loss not only weakened a portion of the case, but also introduced new uncertainty, as the defense seized the opportunity to shift blame onto the deceased, suggesting that he, rather than the accused, had been responsible for the crimes. This argument added a new layer of complexity, forcing the jury to consider not only the evidence presented but also the credibility of competing narratives, one of which could no longer be directly challenged through cross-examination. As the trial finally began, years after the initial disappearance, it quickly became clear that both sides would rely heavily on interpretation and inference rather than definitive physical proof. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven by jealousy, control, and an inability to accept rejection, emphasizing the timeline of events, the phone records, and the repeated confessions as evidence of guilt. They argued that the first crime had gone unpunished due to a lack of evidence, emboldening the perpetrator and allowing him to continue his behavior until it escalated once again nearly a decade later. The defense, on the other hand, focused on the absence of direct forensic evidence linking their client to the murders, highlighting investigative missteps and questioning whether authorities had become too narrowly focused on a single suspect while overlooking other possibilities. They argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and unreliable testimony, urging the jury to consider the reasonable doubt that such gaps created. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional weight of the case was evident, particularly for the families of the victims, who had endured years of uncertainty, only to find themselves reliving the details in a courtroom setting. Testimony often delved into deeply personal and painful territory, recounting not only the events surrounding the disappearances, but also the relationships, fears, and warning signs that had preceded them. For Kara's family, the trial represented a chance to finally have their voices heard after years of waiting, while for the family of the second victim, it was a continuation of a much more recent and still raw loss. As the evidence was presented and arguments were made, the jury was tasked with piecing together a story that spanned nearly a decade, weighing the credibility of witnesses against the absence of definitive physical proof. After days of deliberation, they reached a verdict that reflected both the strengths and limitations of the case. Rather than convicting on the most severe charges for both victims, the jury delivered a mixed decision, finding the defendant guilty of a lesser charge in the earlier case and a more serious charge in the later one. This outcome suggested that while they were convinced of his involvement in both deaths, the passage of time and lack of direct evidence in the first case had created enough uncertainty to prevent a conviction at the highest level. Even so, the combined sentences amounted to a significant period of incarceration, effectively ensuring that he would spend decades behind bars. When the sentence was formally announced, it brought a measure of closure to a case that had remained unresolved for far too long, though it could never fully erase the pain experienced by those who had lost loved ones. For Kara's family, the verdict was bittersweet, as it confirmed what they had long believed while also underscoring the reality that justice delayed can never fully feel like justice served. The years that had passed between her disappearance and the final resolution represented lost time, both in terms of the investigation and in the life she never had the chance to live. In the aftermath of the trial, attention turned to the broader implications of the case, including questions about how earlier warning signs might have been addressed more effectively. The accused had exhibited troubling behavior long before the crimes for which he was ultimately convicted, including allegations of violence, substance abuse, and other offenses that had resulted in relatively minor consequences at the time. In retrospect, these incidents formed a pattern that, had it been taken more seriously, might have prevented further harm. This realization sparked discussions about the importance of recognizing and responding to signs of escalating behavior, particularly in cases involving domestic violence and coercive control. While it is impossible to change the past, such reflections can serve as a reminder of the need for vigilance and intervention in situations where warning signs are present. In the years following the trial, the case continued to be referenced as an example of both the challenges and possibilities of long-term investigations. It demonstrated how persistence, even in the face of limited evidence, can eventually lead to answers, while also highlighting the importance of timely and thorough investigative work. Appeals were filed, as is common in cases of this nature, but the original verdict and sentence were ultimately upheld, reinforcing the conclusion reached by the jury. For the families, this final confirmation marked the end of a long and difficult journey through the legal system, though the emotional impact would remain. They chose to focus on remembering their loved ones, not for the circumstances of their deaths, but for the lives they had lived, holding on to the moments, memories, and connections that defined them beyond the tragedy. In the end, the story that began with a simple decision to leave school during a free period became something far larger, a narrative about loss, resilience, and the long pursuit of truth. It serves as a reminder that even when answers are delayed, they are not always lost, and that behind every case file and courtroom proceeding are real people whose lives and stories deserve to be remembered.